So, good afternoon, everybody. I will continue on the lecture about internal migration. And we were talking specifically about Great Migration that happened in previous decades up to the 1970s of African Americans migrating from the South region of the US to the Northeast and also to the West states as well. And we were talking on this topic that also walked to the North between 1910 and 1970, in the same period that African Americans were moving there. And but they did not experience a series of disadvantages that African Americans had experienced before in the South. So they're moving from the South to the North, but their lives in the South were not such, like they did not suffer prejudice, racism, and so on, and segregation as the African Americans. But also African Americans, when they moved to the North areas of the country, they did also experience segregation, concentration of poverty, and limited residential mobility. So there are studies showing that if you compare whites moving from the South to the North to African Americans, first, whites were better off in terms of socioeconomic status in the South, but also when they moved to the North. And this historical process has to be understood in order to further investigate Black migration and mobility. And there is a really, I mean, I can't even talk about this here before related to this slide. Now the Census Bureau has created some methodologies that we can link census data from the past to the American Community Survey, to the surveys that we have in more contemporary years, in more recent years. And it's pretty much linking people over time, right? So we know from the census in 1930, 1940, where people were, and then we can track them and see where they are right now in more recent years, 1990, 2010, and so on. And when you link these databases, this is all a process that's been going on in the Census Bureau right now, like linking these databases through a series of computational techniques. Some studies are able to better understand mobility of African Americans, and to be more specific, intergenerational mobility of African Americans. So based on information from the census from decades ago, we know where African Americans were and where they are right now. And we can track their children. So we can compare their children with how their parents were some decades ago. So we can evaluate not only mobility of the migrants that moved from the South to the North, but also the mobility of the children of migrants. So if I was an African American in the 1940s living in the South, and I had a specific education attainment socioeconomic status, and then I moved to the North, what is the situation now of my children? So linking these databases over time, we can do this analysis. And what in this paper here from 2003 is more comparison between whites and African Americans, those that moved, and African Americans were in worse situation. But in these more recent papers from 2019, 2020, and this year, because they're able to link these databases, they have been finding that African Americans who moved from the South to the North, their children are better off today than the children of African Americans who stayed in the South. Right? So it's pretty much showing that migration has an association, a positive association with intergenerational mobility. We could say, oh, maybe there is a self-selection, as we discussed before in this class. Maybe the better off African Americans, both in terms of socioeconomic status and health, are the ones who move to the north. So maybe even before they moved, they were in a better situation than the ones that stayed behind. But it's also interesting to see that when they moved, controlling for a series of other characteristics, their children are better in terms of education, overall socioeconomic status than the children of African Americans who stayed back in the South. So all these studies, all these investigations, they are being done right now because now we can link these databases over time. When you link these databases over time, you pretty much have the information of the individual, right? You have a personal identifier key, how it's called by the Census Bureau, the PIK, or PIC, I think they call it PIC. You can link these individuals over time, and then you can do this more refined work about intergenerational mobility. But it's just to show that things that happened in decades ago, they have influence on people who are living now in these northern states, and also the ones who were left behind, who did not get out from the South. Overall, migration changed by Black inner city residents to relocate to the suburbs and to better neighborhoods within the North. So of course, African Americans move to the North as they get better in terms of socioeconomic status, jobs, and so on. They will also want to move to better neighborhoods in the North. At the same time, we can also analyze the opposite flow. We talked about this. Always when there is a migration stream, there is a migration counter stream, because migrants, they keep social networks with people who are left behind. So cross-generational familial and cultural connections contributed for African Americans returning to the South. So African Americans moving from the South to the North contributed to their better well-being, contributed to upward socioeconomic mobility of their children compared to the ones left behind. And also, some of them might want to go back to the southern areas, right? But this return to the South happened only after changes took place in the South towards socioeconomic and political equality for Blacks, and return migration starts to be attractive to them. But of course, still, you have a lot of issues in the South, but not only in the South, in the North as well, related to disadvantage towards African Americans compared to other race ethnicity groups, especially compared to non-Hispanic whites. And in terms of more recent migration, after the 1970s, we see a reverse of migration. So now younger, college-educated migrants are moving to more prosperous and post-civil rights South. Cities and metro areas of Atlanta, Dallas, Houston are among the most popular destinations for whites, Blacks, and new immigrant minorities. I think it was just this last weekend or last week, I saw an article on the New York Times saying why Texas is so attractive. And it was really interesting. It's really those dynamic articles in the New York Times. The guy, the journalist who wrote it, he says, oh, I selected all cities with at least 1,000 people in the US, like thousands of cities. And then out of those, I selected those that they were lower levels of unemployment. Out of those, I selected cities that have some kind of diversity because diversity is important for me, and so on. When he starts going through all these indicators, then several Texas cities fall into that, into being attractive because of good job opportunities, considering their life costs, and also being a diverse state. It's still conservative in terms of who gets selected, but a really diverse state. You have Houston, for example, is a really diverse city. And that, of course, when people are moving to the South, they don't have all these indicators. They don't go into all this data analysis as the journalists from the New York Times did. But people get this kind of information in more informal ways, through friends, relatives, news articles like this one that I just read. And all that is available, and people get to know about it and start moving to those areas. And usually people move into the South in more recent years, more recent decades. These are exactly younger and better educated people, right? And here in this following slides, I'm going to just mention some variation of migration rates or migration. The chances of migrating, they vary by a series of social demographic characteristics of people. So migration varies by age. Today, young adults, those between 20 and 29, are more likely to move than anyone else because they are the ones moving towards getting an university degree. That's the case of you guys here. I don't know if you are all from College Station, probably not. So you moved here to get your degree. When you finish your degree here, you probably will get out to get jobs somewhere that provides you a good job opportunity. And some of you might also marry might also move because of marriage reasons, right? So young people move more, and this move is related to these life course transitions. And these life course transitions are the ones that Martin Bell and his colleagues mentioned in those proximate determinants of migration that I showed you in that diagram early in this lecture. And people with at least 40 years of age are much less likely to move. Older people are more likely to stay in one area because they already have passed through all these life course transitions. Maybe when these people get retired, then they might move somewhere else. But usually older people are less likely to migrate. Highly educated people are more likely to migrate when we have better educational attainment. We usually have more possibilities of getting jobs in other places. We get to know about other job opportunities in a much more dynamic way. And we tend to be more flexible about moving to other places as well. The farther they move, the more likely education will play a major role in the decision of moving, which means that people moving farther away from the place of current residence, moving, for example, to another state, another region of the country, they tend to be, on average, more highly educated than the ones that don't move, okay? Migration also varies by occupation. It's kind of like related to education. White collar workers are the most mobile occupational group. Farm and service workers are the least mobile. Manual workers are more likely to move locally. So pretty much those working in agriculture and service, in the service industry, and manual workers, they are the ones with like the lowest chances of migrating, and manual workers, when they migrate, they tend to move more close into their current residence. And people who are not in the labor force are also likely to move because these are people. When we say people are not in the labor force, that's different than being unemployed. Unemployed is someone who does not have a job, but that person is looking for a job. Not in the labor force is someone who does not have a job, but it's not looking for a job. Could be students, it could be people who just stay at home, it could be retired people. So for example, retired people are not working and are not looking for a job. So they have fewer ties to the place of current residence, so they are more likely to migrate, right? And this thing here is interesting. Many workers are more likely to move locally or even to don't move as white collar workers. I will show you some graphs about trends of internal migration in the US. And we know that Midwestern areas in the country have been suffering a lot with economic stagnation, unemployment rates, and so on for several decades already. But it's still, the probability of people getting out of those areas is really low because they have those ties there, and those, on average, fortunately, we have more manual workers than in other parts of the country. And they also tend to be older, right? When we are trying to understand the reasons of why migration happens, and migration varies by all the social demographic characteristics that I just mentioned, also important to understand the consequences of migration. For example, I just mentioned to you that African Americans that moved to the north during the Great Migration influence not only their socioeconomic outcomes, but also the socioeconomic outcomes of their children. And the decision to migrate is likely done when advantages of moving to the destination outweigh disadvantage of staying in the origin. Moving from one city to the other, moving from one county to the other, moving from one state to the other, one region to the other. It's not a simple thing, right? You are leaving behind a bunch of people that you have all these connections for years. But when you decide to migrate, it's because you are willing to take a risk, and you kind of think, or you should at least think, on average people think, about the advantage of getting out or staying in the place where you are. And if the advantage of getting out at least seem to be better or seem to be higher than the advantage of staying, people move out. Population movements have effects on the places of origin and destination. They affect migrants and non-migrants. So when people move from one area to the other, for example, when we have the urbanization process, people moving from rural to urban areas, that provides a lot of labor and opportunities for people in the urban areas, but also it creates more competition for jobs. And at the same time, it creates a lot of changes in age composition in the rural areas. The rural areas now tend to be have a much more older population proportionally, and experience more economic stagnation. And that affects not only the people who decided to move, but the people who are already living in the destination and the people who are left behind in the origin. The effect of moving for an individual migrant differs from the effect of an aggregate migrant population. My experience as an individual migrant might differ a little bit than another migrant that has the same characteristics as mine and who migrated from the same place that we were before to the same destination. Our outcomes, our challenges, they vary by individual characteristics that we have and the opportunities that we have in the destination. But the overall effect of all these groups of migrants moving to their of destination and origin goes beyond the individual analysis. So that's why migration is such a complex process. And you could say that also fertility and mortality are the same, because individual outcomes also have overall aggregated outcomes. But in terms of migration, you have those effects in two different areas. Whenever we're talking about fertility and mortality, we usually focus on the area where the people are having kids and where they are dying. Migration, you look in two different areas. The effects in the areas where people left and the effects in the areas where people move into. Cool. In terms of the effects of individual migrant, the major effect of migration to an individual migrant, it could be an improvement in their social, economic, political characteristics, political outcomes. And the whole idea is that the characteristics of the areas of destination in all these different aspects tend to be more favorable, at least at the individual point of view, than the area where I was living before. So if I think that the characteristics of the area of destination in terms of socioeconomic indicators, political indicators, physical characteristics, more interesting than the place of my current residence, and I have opportunities, job opportunities in this place of destination, I would tend to move. And these preferences usually depend on migrants' personal observations and experience, so perception. Remember when we were talking about Todaro in the chapter about theories of demography? People will keep moving from rural to urban areas, even if sometimes the economic opportunities in the urban areas are even worse than in the rural areas. Why people keep moving? Because their perceptions, their knowledge about what they can get in the urban areas says that, oh, it's actually better than what I have now. But all these perceptions, this knowledge is limited based on information that each individual has. So the decision to migrate depends on these expectations, perceptions. Where the migrant processes the right to adapt to the new area. Some people might migrate, but after a while, they don't adapt to that area. They might move back or move to another place. Where the migrant is readily accepted, the migrant might experience prejudice, racism, some other form of issues in their area of destination. So they might move to another area or back to the area of origin. And in terms of the effects of aggregate migration, the area of origin is affected by the number and type of people who get out of those areas. A large out-migration will significantly affect an area's potential population growth. So that's what I was talking before. If rural areas, they lose a lot of people in labor ages, the population left behind will tend to be older, and that can have negative effects on economic development, economic growth. If the net migration rate is highly negative and the population is largely elderly, that could have negative effects on potential economic development, economic growth in those areas. And there are two ways that in-migration contributes to the increase of population in the area of destination. The net number of immigrants constitute a direct effect of population increase. So, when I moved from LA to College Station, I am the migrant who made that decision to move, me and my wife. We are the direct migrants affecting the area of destination. But we take with us children that at that time when we moved here, they were 3 months old. Even if they were born here, these are known as the indirect effect of migration. These are the children of migrants that moved into a specific area. So migration has both direct and indirect effects on the area of destination. The direct effect is caused by those people who decided to move, and the indirect effect by those people that came along or were born in the destination by migrants. The magnitude of direct effects depends on the relative size of migrants compared to the receiving population. How many people are moving to Texas right now comparing to the population in Texas? So that's the overall, this proportion is going to say how much the immigrants are going to affect the population here. The magnitude of the indirect effects depends on the relative levels of reproductive behavior of migrants. How many children the migrants moving into Texas are having compared to people who were here before? If the fertility of immigrants to a specific area of destination is higher than the fertility of people who were here before, that might also influence changes in the demographic composition of the population, right? In recent trends in migration, I just got this from an interview with William Frey. He's a professor, demographer. I already mentioned him to you here. He wrote that book, The Diversity Explosion, about the US being more diverse in terms of race ethnicity. And he gave this short interview to NPR, and you can listen to it, and I put the link here, and it's also available in the course website. And he also wrote a short article that's also on the course website. And this is a summary of that article and interview. So in more recent years, in terms of internal migration, the US has been the lowest levels of internal migration since the 1940s. It used to be like around 20% of the population used to move every year to another county within the US between the 1950s and 60s. The economy was really in those decades. And then it fell to less than 10% in 2019, based on data from the American Community Survey. And he tries to speculate some of the effects, from some of the reasons that made internal migration decline in more recent years. Maybe because now we have a higher proportion of the population that's older, at least 5 years of age, and those people are less likely to migrate. Because the labor market is more homogeneous across country, so there's more decentralization of job opportunities, education opportunities throughout the country, so people are more likely to say like, oh, I can stay where I am, don't move to other mid-size or big cities, because where I am, I will have good educational and job opportunities. He also mentions the 2008 economic recession. The 2008 economic recession caused an increase in unemployment rates. So when that happens, of course, unemployed people will be more likely to migrate, but that overall limited job opportunities for people in other areas in the country. So people are less likely to migrate because there are fewer opportunities out there. And also he mentions that telecommunications and jobs from home start to be more common. And what is interesting is that he said that November 2019, before the pandemic, and he mentions at that time that he is on these trends that he had seen in more recent years, that internal migration would increase again, maybe to around 12% a year, instead of being below 10%. But looking at his hypothesis about why internal migration in the US has declined so much, what do we expect now the trends of internal migration to be in the country in these next few years because of the pandemic? We would expect it to decrease even more. The effects on unemployment rates, the effects on the economy during the pandemic were much more drastic and stronger than the 2008 economic recession. Now, we are using much more technology. We are being able to do all these different jobs, teaching, doing all different kinds of activities related to our jobs virtually. You don't have to go to the place where you work. Of course, usually higher paying jobs usually have more chances of being done, having the opportunity to be done from home. And lower paying jobs, you still need to go in person. But all this technology that we have seen developed in this last 1.5 years, because the pandemic, it's not going to disappear. If you go to a restaurant now, it changed even the way that you look at the menu. You use a QR code instead of getting the menu in paper. It changed how many workers people need in the restaurant to run. That is the medical doctors. It's much more common now to have online doctor appointments. So all these things are making people able to find jobs in other areas without having to move to those places, right? So based on these previous findings, we expect that migration, internal migration in the US will tend to decline. In international migration as well, because of all the lockdown measures and increasing in border security, even now with the variant of COVID, the countries closing the borders for specific countries, all that inhibit international immigration into the country. So what I'm trying to show you guys here is that all these discussions that we have in demography are really related to what we experience in these next few years. Based on the approximate determinants of fertility developed by John Bongartz, we expect that fertility will decline, right? Economic opportunities decline. That usually has a negative effect on people getting married. Fewer people getting married, fewer children. So the pandemic tends to have a negative effect on fertility. Mortality, the pandemic is increasing mortality. We have seen that the increase in life expectancy at birth suffered a decline, first because of the opioid crisis in these last few years, but a huge decline now in this last 1.5 years. In migration, as the same thing. So all these things that we're experiencing right now, they will have effects on all three demographic components: fertility, mortality, migration, right? And that creates a lot of questions, a lot of research questions that still have to be answered and investigated, right? And now I'm going to talk to you. This is one portion of a research project that I'm working on. And we are trying to understand internal migration flows in the country, also international migration. But here in these slides, I will focus on internal migration. And to understand internal migration within the country from all these different areas, and we try to use this spatial analysis, we use maps and try to understand what are the patterns of migration in the country by race, ethnicity, by age, and by a series of different socioeconomic characteristics of people. And when we use spatial analysis, the main idea that we recognize people are not randomly distributed over space. I showed you since the beginning of this semester the graphs of population density in the US. Population density is much higher in the West and East Coast in the US compared to the middle areas. And also people migrate from one area to the other, not with the same chances. It depends on job opportunities, it depends on social networks and so on. So people are not randomly distributed, and people do not decide to move to another area, same chances to move to X area, to a Y area, to a Z area. right? People usually are more likely to move to specific areas related to interests. And there is this methodology that we utilize, we use to try to measure these patterns of people moving from one area to the other. It's called the local of spatial association, that identifies clusters in which people tend to go up. Also, what is called the spatial outliers, areas in which people tend to don't migrate a lot, surrounded by other areas that have a lot of people migrating to. So it's local clusters are those in which receive a lot of people, surrounded by areas that receive a lot of people. Another local cluster, not as many people going there, and not as many people going to surrounding areas. And the spatial areas is the opposite. A lot of people going to a specific area, not as many going to surrounding, or not as many going to a specific area, and many going to surrounding areas. So it pretty much creates 4 groups of areas. It estimates contribution to each area and compared to the surrounding areas. And what exactly are neighbors? We could say our neighbors are those counties or those areas within a specific distance from each other. This exercise, we say all those areas that share the border with them, we call them neighbors. But this criteria can change from one research project to the other. And we apply this methodology, internal migration, in areas of destination in the US. So this is exactly what I talked before, the spatial clusters and spatial outlier. It creates these 4 groups of areas. The areas that are called the high are areas with high levels of indicator, surrounded by areas with high levels of that indicator, which analyzes specific research, internal migration. I could do that. I could use this methodology for fertility, for mortality, for income, anything, any variable can be entered there. Housing costs and so on. Here, I'm using this methodology to talk about internal migration. The low areas are areas that are receiving low levels of internal migrants, surrounded by areas with low levels of internal migrants. The spatial outliers are areas, in this case, the high-low, receiving high levels of internal migrants, but they are surrounded by areas with low levels. And the low-high, areas with low levels of internal migrants, surrounded by areas with high levels. What exactly did we analyze? We analyzed the concentration of internal migrants in areas of destination in the US, using information from the 2019 American Community Survey, which is the latest available at this point. And in the American Community Survey, the public available data, we know the area of destination of this person, where the person resides right now. And we also know where the person lived exactly 1 year ago. So in 2019, we know where the person lives, where the person is answering the questionnaire. And we also know where the person lived exactly on April 1st, 2018, right? That's the question that I mentioned to you before that we collect on ACS. Public available data does not have the information of county of current residence and county of residence 1 year ago. For confidentiality issues, that information is not publicly available. That is available in the restricted data center, for example, the one that we have here at Texas A&M, one of 25 or 30 in the country is located here, and then there we can analyze restricted data from the census and know even find the geographical areas where people live and used to live. This exercise, I just use public data, public available data. And the public available data does not inform which county the person lives, which PUMA the person lives. What is PUMA? It's just this area that the Census Bureau created in order to make it harder for people to be identified with public available data. It stands for public use microdata areas. And the pumas have at least 100,000 people living within them. So counties with really big populations are disaggregated, and counties with small populations, they are aggregated in order to generate the pumas. Areas of residence 1 year ago in public available data, they are not even pumas, they are groups of pumas, which are referred as the MIG pumas. So what we do for this exercise is put everything in the MIG puma level. Which area, which MIG puma the person lived before, and then we aggregate these pumas to the same level as here to know which MIG puma they live right now. So the pumas aggregation of counties, so we have at least 100,000 people living in each one of them, or can be disaggregation of counties for counties that are too big. How do you exactly see this on the space? We have 2,378 pumas and 1,005 MIG pumas. What we pretty much do is analyze. We group these ones in the current residence to the same level as previous, and we analyze flows from 1,005 areas to 1,005 areas, right? So we just aggregate this number, these people here into bigger areas. Just to give you an idea, here you have the states in red, and these fine areas here in blue are the pumas, and the black areas that you see they're a little bigger, they are the MIG pumas. So for example, within this MIG puma here, we have a series of pumas within them. And you see that in several different areas. And for states with a more sparse population, you don't have as many subdivisions. But why did the Census Bureau also create these MIG pumas of previous residents? Also because of confidentiality issues. Because if we know the puma where the person lives, the puma of residence 1 year ago, and all the other socioeconomic characteristics the person reports on the census, we would be much able to identify those people in real life. So that's why all this information is aggregated. For this exercise, what I'm talking about, we have these 1,005 MIG pumas, get both from residence 1 year ago and current residents, and analyze the flow among these 1,005 areas. Okay? When we classify migrants, internal migrants, those who live in another MIG puma 1 year ago, 1 year before the survey, so exactly on April 1st, 2018. No migrants are those who reside in the same MIG puma in the previous year. And international migrants are those who reside in another country 1 year ago. But for this analysis, for these maps, they are not included in this specific analysis here. So this is a simple map, pretty much showing the proportion of internal migrants in the areas of destination using data from 2019 and saying, what's the proportion of people within this area right now that moved here in the last year, from 2018 to 19. And then you see here that these lighter areas here have really low levels of internal migrants. It's 0.7% to 3.9%. And the dark areas have from 7.5% of internal migrants up to almost 17% of internal migrants. So the darker areas have between 7.5 and 17% of internal migrants that moved to those areas within this time period. So that's a lot of people, right? You start to think like 17% of the people who live in these dark areas here now moved here. 70% of the people who live in those areas moved here in this last year. I mean, we kind of like can understand this graph a little bit, kind of saying like, oh, there is more migration to these areas that are darker and fewer migration to these lighter areas. but it's a little bit messy, right? In football, I prefer Messi than Neymar, but in maps, I don't really like messy maps. It's better to have more organized maps. And what's a way to simplify the analysis is to use the local indicators of spatial association, LISA, that creates those 4 groups of areas. So it compares the level of internal migration in a specific area and compare it into other areas. And that's the result of LISA for the overall proportion of internal migrants is this map here. So the areas in red are areas receiving higher levels of internal migrants and are surrounded by areas with a lot of internal migrants. In this case here, these 2 were highlighted in red. But it's interesting that this one here that had higher levels, it's not highlighted in red. It's taken as being non-significant because surrounding it, you had both high levels of internal migration and low levels in the other case. These areas in pink, they are areas with high levels of internal migration surrounded by low levels of internal migration. That's the case, for example, for this area, high levels of internal migration surrounded by low levels. So it becomes pink. These areas here in, let's say, let's go in order. In light blue, low levels of internal migration surrounded by high levels of internal migration. This area, low level, surrounded by higher levels overall. So it got this information, it falls into this specific subgroup. And then areas with low levels of internal migration surrounded by low. These guys here, surrounded by low. And then all the other areas in white, it's pretty much saying that you have all kinds of levels, higher and low in a more randomly distributed way, right? When it falls into one of these 4 groups, we are saying, oh, there is a cluster, there is an outlier, there is a pattern. The non-significant, there is no pattern. Internal migration is kind of like randomly distributed in those areas that are shown in white here, or light gray, okay? So we start to see that we have a lot of migration, for example, to Texas, to Florida, and lower levels of internal migration to other areas in the South and also in the Northeast. But this community survey provides us more refined information about people. We can break them down by race, ethnicity, by age, by sex, by whether they are US born or foreign born. And here I'm going to just show you a few graphs, a few maps that I generated by using these subgroups of population. So here we have internal migrants on the right-hand side and non-migrants on the left-hand side. Internal migrants are those who change residence between 18 and 19. Foreign-born non-migrants is someone who is not born in the US, was living in a specific area in 2018, and now is living in the same area in 2019. That person is a foreign-born, came to the US a while ago, but in this last year, that person did not migrate within the country. So that's a foreign-born, non-internal migrant based on movement between 18 and 19. US-born non-migrant are people born in the US who live in the same area in 2019 and 18. US-born internal are people born in the US, but who live in one area in 2018 and now are somewhere else in 19. Foreign-born internal migrants are people who were born in other countries and between 2018 and 19 moved from one area to the other. When you break down any indicator, in our case here, internal migration, by subgroups of the population, and you see different patterns of that variable. It can be a table, it can be a graph, it can be a map. When you see different patterns from one, in this case, map to the other, then you have to start to understand why that happens. Then you start to come up with scientific hypotheses about that based on your previous knowledge, based on previous literature review. And what we see is that US-born people who are known migrants, did not migrate in this last year, are more likely to be located in these areas in the country, so Midwest and also in the southern areas. And these areas tend to be the ones who have the lower economic opportunities for people. But you remember when I talked about before, the migration patterns by age. Usually older people are less likely to migrate. Usually manual workers are less likely to migrate. So an interesting research question would be, are these people here older people and manual workers? So we can analyze going depth about these people, US-born, no migrants, and try to understand why they stay in these areas and why there are fewer of them, for example, in California, in Texas, in Florida, and so on. What about the foreign-born non-migrants? Exactly the opposite. As we know, most foreign-born people in more recent years in the US, they are coming from Latin America, increasing from Asia, but mostly from Latin America in these last decades. Then you have higher proportion of foreign-born exactly on the states close to the southern border and also in Florida and in New York, right? And also in the Northeast. But these are people who moved to those areas a while ago, and then 18 and 19 did not move, but are more concentrated in the red areas and less concentrated in the dark blue areas. And you see, you have much fewer outliers, right? The pink and the light blue, you see them not as much here. You really have this pattern of people concentrating in areas that are related to the other, either high, high, or low, low. And the US-born people who migrated in the last year tend to go to more these western areas and also to Texas and Oklahoma. And foreign-born internal migrants, when they move, they tend to move exactly to the places where no migrants are already there, California, Texas, and Florida, and New York. And they are less likely to migrate exactly where they are more US-born non-migrants. Red here, white here. One complements the other, right? And then we can break it down by race, ethnicity, by nativity anymore, not by whether people are US-born or foreign-born. And all these maps here are about internal migrants. It's not about non-migrants anymore. We broke it down by internal migrants who are non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic African Americans, Hispanics, and non-Hispanic Native Americans. I did not include here the maps for the other race ethnicity groups. But again, the patterns of concentration of internal migrants to where internal migrants are going depending on the race ethnicity, these patterns are really different from one map to the other. Again, brings up some research questions. Why is this happening? Non-Hispanic whites, when they migrate, they tend to go to more these northwest areas and really less likely to go California, Texas, and some other southern areas. Hispanics, when they migrate, when I'm talking here about Hispanics, they could be born in the US. They're not necessarily foreign born. Here, I'm not breaking it down by nativity, just by race ethnicity. So Hispanics here could be people born in the US or abroad. But when Hispanics move, where do they tend to move? From 2018 to 19, exactly in areas closer to the southern border, in Florida, and less likely to migrate to all this middle part of the country, the Midwest and southern areas. African Americans. The result for African Americans, for me, it's also amazing. I mean, it's all telling us, right? African Americans. We were talking about the Great Migration at the beginning of the class today. And then you have the post-Great Migration of people returning to the South. Does this map corroborate that hypothesis or not? It does, right? Because the areas where non-Hispanic African Americans are moving more in this recent year, from 2018 to 19, are exactly more southern areas. So in last decades, they tend to go more to the north, and now they're going back. And all this portion of the US in dark blue have lower levels of internal migration of African Americans. So all these areas receive fewer levels, lower levels of African Americans. And the non-Hispanic Native Americans moving into these northern states and to Oklahoma and to New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, you see that they are going into areas where tends to have more reservations of Native Americans, right? Is that exactly the reason why they are moving there? That's an indication, right? We don't have a question on the American about the reason that people are moving to those specific areas highlighted in red here. But since we know a little bit about the country history, where things are, where they used to be, we understand the current patterns of internal migration, right? And this is just the beginning of a big research project, because I could do the same maps from 2005 until 2019, one for each year. We can do this breaking it down by age, by occupation. We can combine race ethnicity with nativity, foreign-born Hispanics to US-born Hispanics, for example. And the same thing for the other groups. So we can break it down, but as you break it down, you have more questions to answer, right? And that's the good thing, to understand all these different patterns of demographic components. In this case, specifically internal migration. Cool. So this last portion of this lecture, it is in the course textbook. I will not go in detail about it, about internal migration in China. Their slides are available there. But since I'm not going to go in detail about it, this part here is not going to be evaluated in the final exam or in any quiz, okay? But the portion that I did include from a research project that I explained here in detail will be included in quizzes and the final exam. And just one thing, the final exam technically is easier than the previous exams because you have more time, 2 hours and 30 minutes instead of 1 hour and 50 minutes. The same amount of questions, 40 questions. It's not cumulative, so it's going to be pretty much only about these topics that we covered after exam 3, right? And it happens on December 15th. That's the date stipulated by the university. Just to show you here in the course website, this lecture is available here, as you know. And I just provide here some other tools that we can have in order to generate those maps. I use this free software called Geoda that you can download. There is a lot of information on their website about how to use the software. It's really user-friendly, and you can download it. There is a manual online, and the manual is more like like a bunch of HTML pages that you click on the links, a specific topic that you want to learn. So it's really dynamic. Table curve 2D and these other modeling migration rates. These are more advanced topics in internal migration, trying to understand the pattern of migration rates by age. And this is the article, the short article from William Frey about the low levels of internal migration in the US based on 2019 data. In his short interview to NPR about this trend. And his article is just available for free in the website of the Brookes Institute, right? Cool. Any questions? All goody? For international migration that we will start now, we have the lecture there, and I have a series of extra readings because international migration has become such a controversial topic in the US. So I just want to provide more information, more research findings about the effects of immigrants on the economy. So I compress here a bunch of articles, and you can just download this compressed file, and also some articles about the controversy that happened when the previous federal administration was trying to include a citizenship question in the 2020 census, and also discussions about the previously proposed southern border wall that continues in the national debate, because although the president changed, still some governors being pushing towards building a southern border wall, including the Texas governor. And here there's some short, like this one is a shorter interview about whether immigration creates jobs. So it's a really, like, from Yale, professor from Yale, talking about like that actually immigrants do not hurt the job opportunities for US born people. They actually create more dynamic in the economy. And this is a longer interview with the 2019 Nobel Prize winning economist. And in one specific portion of this longer interview, she mentions exactly, she provides an overview of studies that shows that immigrants do not hurt labor outcomes, earnings, or job opportunities of US born people. And I will summarize some of these findings in the lecture here about international migration. So, I will start by talking about definitions and concepts of international migration, showing some patterns of international migration in the world, and then I start going to the US. And then I will talk about specific points of immigration in the US, undocumented immigrants, that's controversial topic about undocumented immigrants, whether they hurt the economy or not. The proposed southern border wall, here is pretty much to show that policy proposal was not based on science, it's completely counterproductive. It's pretty much a waste of tax-paying money. And here, I'm just summarizing a series of articles from demographers and economists. And the economic effects of immigration, I also summarize a series of articles, some of them saying that immigrants hurt the job opportunities of US born people, and the majority saying that they don't hurt. And then there is an interesting summary article that I will mention to you, showing that actually these different analysis or findings of whether immigrants hurt the job opportunities for US born people is actually more related to a methodological strategy than anything else. But data suggests that immigrants do not hurt job opportunities of US born people. And then I summarize a paper in which the authors, they simulate the implementation of an immigration system in the US similar to the Canadian system, in which people are they receive visa to migrate to the US in the simulation in the same merit, with the same merit procedures that immigrants receive visas going to Canada. And the main point here is to say that if the US implemented that same point system in Canada, which was discussed in the previous federal administration, that would not cause any differences in terms of educational attainment or composition of the US population. So again, it would be a waste of public resources, all right? So just going back a little bit, these are things that we discussed this lecture, so I will go faster here. The first international migration of humans are believed to have happened around 60,000 years ago. International migration is a movement of people changing residence from one country to another. And as we talk about internal migration have effects both in the areas of origin and destination, international migration has both positive and negative impacts in the countries of origin and destination. When we are talking about internal migration, in the destination, we use the term in migration. In the origin, we talk about out migration. For international migration, we use the terms immigration and emigration. Immigration, that's when I'm doing the analysis of these migration flows, looking and usually focusing on the effects on the country of destination. Immigration refers to the movement of people to a new country for the purpose of establishing permanent residence. So if I'm trying to understand what are the influences of immigrants in the US as a destination country, I'm doing a study focusing on the immigrant effects. And an immigrant is a person who crossed the international boundary with the intention to live permanently in a new country. The person is not moving there in a temporary basis. It refers to the permanent departure of people from a country. And if I'm trying to focus on what are the effects of all these young adults moving out of Latin America, moving out of Asia and going to the US, what's going to be the effect back to the country of origin? Well, immigration refers to the permanent departure of people from a country, and when I do an analysis of immigration, I'm trying to understand the effects of these migration flows in the country of origin. An immigrant is a person who moves away from a country with the intention to establish a permanent residence somewhere else. Long-term immigration. In every international migration, a migrant is simultaneously an immigrant and an emigrant. Just depends on your point of view. Are you focusing on the area of destination? Immigrant. On the area of origin? Immigrant. Usually when we use the term long-term immigration is when the residence establishment in the destination country is usually at least 1 year. Long-term immigrants comprise around 3% of the world's population in 2013. And in recent decades, the number of long-term immigrants has increased drastically from 75 million in 1964 to more than 230 million in 2013. The Syrian civil war influenced a lot of this, the migration of across the border. So a lot of Syrian refugees, they moved to Turkey, they moved to Lebanon, Jordan, northern Iraq, and so on. So all these different issues that happen across the world influence international migration, both voluntary and involuntary. Return migration is something that we talked before. The term that's more used in the textbook is called remigration. I usually use more the term return migration. Remigration refers to the return of international migrants back to their home countries. A immigrant is an international migrant who returns back to reestablish permanent residence in the original country of residence. And you remember when we talked about the salmon effect in the Hispanic mortality paradox, that Hispanics on average have a lower socioeconomic status than the white population in the US, but they have better health outcomes. And one of the reasons could be because the Hispanics in all the ages who are sick, they might decide to move back to their home country. If those Hispanics are foreign born, they move to their home country, and then their death is not going to be counted in the US, it's going to be counted somewhere else. So that's an analysis of return migration, right? Tourists and visitors are not international migrants because they are not moving, going to a specific country in order to stay there permanently. Their visits to another country is usually short-term. Their visits do not involve establishing permanent residence in the destination country. But what has happened in the US in these last few decades is that people enter the country with visa and overstay their visas. So most of the undocumented immigrants in the US right now, they are not entering through the southern border, crossing the border. They are entering with tourist visa and they overstay their visas. We're going to talk about this in this lecture. But tourists that come and go back before the visa expires, which is most of them, they are not considered immigrants because their stay is only temporary. The textbook kind of like subdivides immigrants in these four broad groups. A refugee or asylee is someone who involuntarily immigrates from his or her native country to usually a neighboring new country due to persecution, violence, or deprivation. That's the case of Syrian refugees going again to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, northern Iraq because of the Syrian civil war. That's the case, for example, of people in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador moving out of those countries because of issues of violence and poverty and trying to come to the US. A migrant from a former colony is someone who moves from a decolonized country to its former imperial country seeking better living conditions. So for example, countries in Africa that were colonized by France, people there now tend to move more likely when they decide to move to France than to other European countries. The same thing about former colonies from Portugal, Spain. So Brazilians, for example, they go a lot to Portugal exactly in those times where we have a lot of economic recession, like we had in 1980s and we are experiencing right now. You see a lot of migration from these previous colonies into their into the countries that used to colonize them. And usually because you have these links, if not family links because so many generations, but at least in terms of language, right? An economic migrant is someone who voluntarily moves to live in a destination country for economic reasons. Usually in the US, we are talking more about these people here. Because most of the people moving to the US looking for better socioeconomic conditions, better life quality. And a privileged migrant is someone who is a descendant of a nation's ethnic core group living outside of their mother country for generations. Happens a lot, for example, in Latin America. Immigrants from, even in recent years, from Germany, from Italy, who wants to go to another country to start a new life, but not necessarily, not because they were suffering persecution, violence, or poverty. Not because that country was because they are former colony. Like for example, in my example, Germans or Italians going to Latin America. That's not the case. They're not looking for better economic outcomes. They're just moving to those other places to a new lifestyle. So that happens as well. So you have all these different groups and reasons of why people move from one country to the other. This slide is really important. It's pretty much In the US, whenever we classify immigrants, we usually use these terms: first generation immigrant, 1.5th generation immigrant, second generation, third generation. So first generation is like me. I'm born in another country and now I live in the US. 1.5th generation are those who arrived in the country of destination up to the age of 12. So they enter a specific country when they were children. So they start to adapt faster to the destination culture, society, compared to the first generation. Okay? And it's 2 p.m. now. This is an important slide that I want to go more in detail with you. So I will stop here. And quiz 18 is open now. Then we have quiz 19 on Thursday and the final quiz 20 on the last day of class, 1 week from now. And then we have the final exam on December 15th, okay? So not many classes to go. Let's concentrate because these final points are important. So thank you very much. And I see you guys on Thursday. Thank you.